But I suddenly became a threat to Carson. And he did everything he said. I never told him. First one I called was Carson.
For more than 20 years, Joan Rivers and Johnny Carson were one of television's closest pairs, the queen of comedy and the king of late night. But one phone call changed everything. The moment it happened, Carson hung up, and he never spoke to her again. Not once, not for the rest of his life. What could drive such a deep and permanent silence between two people who had shared laughter, success, and friendship in front of millions? Was it betrayal, ego, or something far more personal? This is the real reason Johnny Carson never forgave Joan Rivers, and why their feud became one of the most haunting stories in Hollywood history. Long before the feud, there was respect, admiration, and a sense of family. When Joan Rivers first walked onto the stage of The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson in February 1965, she was not a household name. She was a struggling stand-up comedian trying to break through in an industry that offered few doors for women. Carson, already an icon of American television, immediately recognized something rare in her: sharp intelligence wrapped in fearless humor. That night, when the cameras stopped rolling, he looked straight at her and said, "You are going to be a star." Those words would change everything. Rivers became a regular guest, and audiences fell in love with her quick wit and bold honesty. In a male-dominated world of comedy, she pushed boundaries and said what no one else dared. Over the years, Carson became both her champion and her mentor. He guided her, encouraged her, and gave her the kind of exposure that no one else could. Each time she guest-hosted The Tonight Show, viewers saw a different kind of energy: edgy, spontaneous, and electric. She was the first woman to ever hold that position, and for a time, it seemed as if she might inherit the late-night throne itself. Their relationship wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Rivers often said that Carson was the man who made her career. When she appeared on The Tonight Show, she wasn't just another comedian doing a set. She was part of Carson's inner circle, the select few he trusted to carry the show in his absence. Off-camera, they shared phone calls, advice, and laughter. She admired his timing, his generosity, and his calm authority. He admired her nerve, her fearlessness, and her ability to make even the most uncomfortable truths sound funny. For over 20 years, their bond seemed unbreakable. When Joan Rivers guest-hosted The Tonight Show, she owned it. Ratings soared, fans loved her, and many thought she'd one day replace Johnny Carson. But tension was brewing. As her fame grew, NBC worried she had too much influence, and Joan began wondering if it was time for her own show. No one, not even Joan, could have imagined that one choice would end everything they'd built. By the mid-1980s, Joan Rivers had become a household name. Her biting red carpet commentary, best-selling comedy albums, and bold stand-up specials made her one of the most recognizable figures in entertainment. But there was still one ceiling she had not yet broken: hosting her own late-night show. At the time, Johnny Carson's Tonight Show was untouchable. It dominated ratings and defined what late night looked like. Every network wanted its own version, and executives at the newly created Fox network saw Joan Rivers as their perfect chance to compete. In 1986, they approached her with an offer: her own show, The Late Show starring Joan Rivers, which would air directly opposite The Tonight Show. It was a massive risk and an even bigger opportunity. For Rivers, it was the dream she had waited her entire career for. Fox promised creative freedom, a multi-million-dollar contract, and the chance to make history again. But there was one problem. Out of respect, and perhaps affection, she knew she needed to tell Johnny first. For years, NBC had quietly reassured her that she was in line to replace Carson when he eventually retired. But when she checked with the network, she was shocked to learn that her name was not even on the list of potential successors. It was a painful wake-up call, a sign that no matter how many years she had filled in for Carson, she was still seen as second tier. So when Fox called, Rivers said yes. And that single word changed the course of her life. She later explained that she did not intend to betray Carson or NBC. She thought he would understand, that he, of all people, would be proud to see her take a leap forward. But timing, pride, and network politics turned what should have been a celebration into the beginning of a Cold War. When the deal went public, Johnny Carson didn't hear it from Joan. He heard it from the press. Overnight, headlines screamed that Joan Rivers was leaving The Tonight Show to go head-to-head with her mentor. It looked like betrayal, and the tabloids ran with it. Rivers said she called Carson right away to explain it wasn't personal. He answered, listened for a moment, then hung up without a word. That was it. No apology, no conversation. From that day on, Johnny Carson never spoke to Joan Rivers again. Was it really about business, or had something much deeper been broken? The moment Johnny Carson hung up that phone, a 2-decade friendship dissolved in seconds. To most of Hollywood, it seemed unthinkable. Rivers had been one of Carson's closest allies, and now she was persona non grata on his show, and, quietly, across the entire NBC network. Overnight, the laughter they had shared for years turned into a wall of silence that would never be lifted. Behind the scenes, Carson's reaction was fueled by more than business rivalry. He felt personally betrayed. To him, The Tonight Show was more than just a television program. It was an institution, one that demanded loyalty. Rivers had been not only his protégé, but his chosen successor in the eyes of the audience. In Carson's world, she had gone behind his back to launch a show that would compete directly against his own. Whether that perception was fair or not, it cut deeply. Those who worked on The Tonight Show at the time said Carson viewed her decision as a public rejection, almost as if she had turned her back on the man who had given her a career. One staff member recalled that Carson felt she had used him to build her fame, only to walk away when something better came along. His pride, already legendary, couldn't handle what he saw as a betrayal on a grand stage. For Rivers, the reality was more complex. She said she had tried repeatedly to reach him afterward, leaving messages, sending letters, and even trying to approach him at industry events. But he never responded. He never mentioned her name again publicly. When she was brought up in interviews, he changed the subject or brushed it off entirely. For a man known for his charm and easy humor, that cold silence spoke volumes. The fallout was instant. Carson quietly told NBC to never book Joan Rivers again. It wasn't a written ban. It didn't need to be. In Hollywood, everyone knew better than to cross the king of late night. For Rivers, the price was devastating. Her new Fox show launched with huge buzz, but the pressure was relentless. Critics were harsh, ratings slipped, and constant comparisons to Carson followed her everywhere. Behind the scenes, network interference and creative clashes took a toll, spilling into her marriage with her husband and producer Edgar Rosenberg. Carson never spoke publicly against her, but his silence was deafening. Friends urged him to forgive her, yet he never did. The man who once said she'd be a star now acted like she didn't exist. Neither realized how far the fallout would spread, not just between them, but across all of Hollywood. What happened next would prove just how powerful Johnny Carson really was. After Johnny Carson's final hang-up, Joan Rivers was no longer just another talk show host. She was a symbol of defiance in an industry that thrived on loyalty. But in Hollywood, defiance comes with a price. Almost immediately after The Late Show starring Joan Rivers launched, networks and insiders began to distance themselves from her. Carson never issued a public statement, yet his disapproval was understood everywhere. Within weeks, doors that had always been open suddenly began to close. Writers, producers, and even comedians who once called her a friend stopped returning calls. She was not officially blacklisted, but she might as well have been. Everyone knew the unspoken rule. If Johnny didn't like you, you didn't exist in late night. The Late Show itself began to struggle. The Fox network was brand new and untested, and Rivers' show was its first big gamble. Production issues, ratings battles, and behind-the-scenes tension made it hard to find footing. She was under immense pressure to succeed, not just for herself, but for the network. And when ratings slipped, the network panicked. They started making changes, cutting budgets, reworking segments, and questioning her direction. The creative freedom she'd been promised started to fade away. As the tension grew, so did the strain on her marriage. Her husband, Edgar Rosenberg, was the show's producer, and their personal and professional lives collided daily. The stress, the public scrutiny, and the weight of failure created cracks that widened fast. In less than a year, the show was canceled. The dream that had cost her a friendship, a mentor, and her reputation was gone. Carson said nothing. No gloating, no comment, just silence. To many, it felt like quiet victory, proof that Joan should never have left. For Rivers, it was devastation. Her show's collapse was public and brutal. The press called her the woman who challenged the king and lost. When her husband Edgar's struggles ended in tragedy, Joan was left completely alone. But she refused to disappear. She worked small clubs, took any gig, and rebuilt herself from scratch. Still, Carson's silence haunted her, not out of pride, but because she had once seen him as family. In time, people began to wonder, was Carson's anger really about betrayal or control? Why hold on to bitterness for so long? That question led to a theory far more personal than anyone expected. On the surface, the feud between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers seemed like a simple story of professional betrayal, a student defying her teacher. But the more time passed, the clearer it became that something deeper was driving Carson's silence. It wasn't just about ratings or competition, it was about power, pride, and the shifting roles of men and women in television. Joan Rivers herself believed that gender played a major role in what happened. In interviews years later, she said, "I think Johnny felt because I was a woman. I was his, like I belonged to him." That statement wasn't about romance, it was about ownership. Carson had helped launch her career, and in his eyes, that meant loyalty, perhaps even lifelong loyalty. But for Rivers, who had fought tooth and nail for every opportunity in a male-dominated industry, that sense of ownership was suffocating. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, television was ruled by powerful men. There were no female late-night hosts, no women in the control rooms, and almost no space for female voices that didn't fit neatly into the role of sidekick or guest. Rivers had shattered that mold. She wasn't just another comedian. She was bold, unfiltered, and willing to go head-to-head with anyone, including Carson himself. To some, that made her a trailblazer. To others, it made her dangerous. When Joan Rivers joined Fox, she wasn't just taking a new job, she was breaking the rules of late-night TV. She stepped into a space long reserved for men and did it with confidence. But Carson's reaction showed how fragile that world really was. His silence wasn't disappointment, it was punishment. Still, Joan refused to fold. Shut out from The Tonight Show and blacklisted across networks, she kept going, touring, doing commercials, and reinventing herself through cable and home shopping. She turned rejection into fuel and built her own empire. Yet one question lingered. Would Carson have reacted the same if a man had done it? Others had left his show without facing exile. But Joan's defiance hit harder. A woman breaking ranks, refusing to stay under control. Her story grew beyond a feud. It became a symbol of how women in entertainment were treated when they dared to lead. Decades later, young comedians still called her a pioneer, the one who took the hit so others could rise. Carson never mentioned her again, but his silence said everything. To him, the betrayal was final. To her, it proved she had struck a nerve that went far deeper than fame. And just as her career began to rise again, a new tragedy would soon test her strength in ways she could never have imagined. The cancellation of The Late Show, starring Joan Rivers, wasn't just the end of a television project, it was the collapse of a dream. Within months of losing her show, Rivers's world unraveled in ways she never could have imagined. The failure wasn't just public, it was deeply personal. Her husband, Edgar Rosenberg, who had served as her producer and closest collaborator, was overwhelmed by the pressure and humiliation of the show's demise. Just 3 months after the cancellation, he took his own life. The tragedy shattered Joan Rivers. She hit rock bottom, emotionally, financially, and spiritually. Hollywood turned its back. Friends stopped calling. She was a widow, a single mother, and a comedian whose career had vanished overnight. What started as a feud with Carson now symbolized something bigger. How fast fame fades when you step outside the rules. But Joan refused to quit. She performed anywhere that would have her. Clubs, cruise ships, private events. Audiences still loved her honesty and bite. Through pain, she found freedom. She no longer cared about Hollywood's approval. She had already lost everything. Now, she would live and work on her own terms. Slowly, she rebuilt. The Joan Rivers Show ran 5 years and won her an Emmy. Fashion Police later made her a red carpet legend. Every comeback was defiance. Proof she didn't need permission to succeed. Still, Carson's ghost lingered. When asked about him, she spoke with sadness and grace. "He was wrong," she said, "but I never stopped being grateful." That mix of love and loss defined her for life. To those who knew her, Edgar's death and Carson's silence were two sides of the same wound. A woman punished for wanting more, yet brave enough to turn pain into performance. She joked about what others feared to say, turning tragedy into laughter. Carson never reached out, not when she won awards, not when friends tried to mend things, not even at the end. The silence lasted until he was gone. Years later, when Joan finally returned to The Tonight Show, long after Carson's passing, it felt like a full-circle moment. The feud that had defined decades was finally laid to rest. Still, one question lingered. Was forgiveness ever truly possible, or had the damage gone too deep? For nearly 30 years, Joan Rivers' name vanished from The Tonight Show. Her voice, her image, her legacy, erased from the stage that had once made her a star. A new generation grew up, never knowing she'd helped shape late-night television itself. But Joan never stopped. She outlasted the blacklist, the whispers, and the industry that once turned its back on her. She kept fighting, and, in the end, she won. Then, in February 2014, something remarkable happened. Jimmy Fallon, newly appointed as host of The Tonight Show, invited Joan Rivers back to the stage. When she walked through those familiar curtains for the first time since 1986, the audience erupted. Fallon stood, arms open, beaming as he welcomed her with the respect and warmth she had been denied for decades. The moment was brief, but symbolic, a restoration of history. The audience saw not just a comedian returning to a stage, but a survivor reclaiming her rightful place. Rivers was radiant that night, sharper than ever, her timing flawless. It was as if she had never left, but behind the laughter was something deeper, the quiet sense that an old wound had finally been acknowledged, even if it could never truly be healed. Johnny Carson had passed away in 2005, and with him went any chance of reconciliation. Still, his shadow loomed large over the moment. Fallon later said he invited her because she should have always been there. For Rivers, that simple act of kindness felt like closure, not revenge, not vindication, just peace. In the years since, their story has come to represent something much larger than a feud. It's a lesson about power, pride, and the invisible cost of ambition. Carson remains a legend, a master of timing and grace, whose influence still defines the format of late-night talk shows. But even his admirers admit that his treatment of Rivers was one of his most human flaws, a reminder that even giants can let ego cloud compassion. For Joan, the feud became part of her story. It followed her everywhere, until she learned to own it, laugh at it, and turn it into fuel. "If you don't laugh at your own pain," she said, "someone else will." Her resilience became her legacy. By her passing in 2014, she was more than a comedian. She was a pioneer, a survivor, and a symbol of fearless ambition. Today, the Carson-Rivers feud is remembered as more than bitterness. It's the story of two icons, the mentor and the rebel, bound by pride, love, and loss. Their clash reflected Hollywood itself, a world built on loyalty and reinvention, where friendship and rivalry often share the same stage. And maybe the real reason Johnny Carson never forgave Joan Rivers wasn't betrayal or ego, it was heartbreak. Because behind the fame and laughter was trust. And once that trust was broken, even the greatest talker in the world had nothing left to say. In the end, their feud wasn't just about a show, it was about two people who built something special, then lost it to pride and pain. Carson's silence became legend. Rivers turned that silence into strength. Their story shows how fragile success and friendship can be in a world ruled by ego. Joan forgave by moving forward and making people laugh. Johnny stayed silent, maybe to protect what once mattered most. But one thing is clear. Together, they changed television forever. What do you think? Was Carson right to feel betrayed? Or did Rivers just take the chance she earned? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories. Because sometimes, the biggest drama happens off camera. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of Hollywood legends. Your support helps us bring you more of the fascinating, forgotten, and controversial moments that shaped entertainment history. Because sometimes, the biggest stories in show business aren't about the spotlight, they're about what happens when it suddenly goes dark.